Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to St. Patrick's Day, Take 2. Only 6 months late because of circumstances that I do not have to explain to you this year. Thanks to AmeriCeltic, Tony and Celia for organising this, bringing it all together, and Cedar Dobson in particular for making it all happen. My name's Alan Purves and I'm a Scot by birth. I've lived in the United States for 41 plus years and here in Pleasanton in the Bay Area for just over 26 years. I'm not a particular expert in whisky, despite that Tony in his wisdom asked me to do this little presentation today on whisky. As I say, I'm not an expert, more an enthusiastic amateur, even if self-described. So without further ado, what is whisky? Whisky derives from the Gaelic phrase Whisky ba, which quite appropriately means water of life, and it describes distilled alcohol derived from grain. So you can buy whisky from any country in the world that chooses to distill and produce it, and you can buy whisky from many kinds of types of grain. Bourbon in the United States is very popular, originating from corn. You can buy rye whiskies. There's even rice whiskey that you can buy from Japan, if not other countries. So in simple terms, it's a grain-based distilled alcohol. The ingredients simply are that grain, very importantly water, and yeast. So 3 simple ingredients. I'm going to talk today, as we are celebrating the life of a Celtic saint, about whiskies from 2 particular countries, Scotland and Ireland. And just to get into the legal terms, Scotch whisky must be produced from a grain distilled, in Scotland. Irish whisky must be distilled in Ireland. They both must be aged for a minimum of 3 years in Ireland in wooden casks, in Scotland specifically in oak casks, and then bottled in their country of origin at a minimum ABV of 40%, which is 80 proof, if you like that term. So while you can buy whisky from any part of the world, you can only buy Scotch whisky. And by the way, Scotch describes the drink, not the people. So I am Scots or Scottish. I am not Scotch, despite the fact I've drunk my fair share over the years. And similarly, Irish whisky must originate in Ireland. The most common kind of whisky is a blended whisky, and the reason for that is consistency. It may originate from a certain gentleman, Mr. Johnny Walker. It's said that he wanted people to buy his red label, black label, green label, whatever, 1 year, maybe 5 years later, 10 years later, and still get essentially the same product. And the only way you can do that is by taking whiskies from many distilleries, in some cases 30 or 40 in some brands, and marrying or blending them together. Blended whiskey usually contains a mixture of single malt whiskey, which I'll describe in a second, and other grain whiskies. And again, that helps provide the consistency. So single malt, my example today is this Clenrothes, specifically says single malt Scotch whisky and aged 10 years. What that label is telling you, single malt comes from a single distillery, Clenrothes in this case, and it's made only from malted barley. The 10-year age statement means that it's been in a wooden cask, an oak cask in Scotland for a minimum of 10 years. Single malt doesn't necessarily mean single cask. Usually the master distiller will look at his casks that are 10 years and older and marry together a variety of those casks till he's happy with that product, proud to put his name and the distillery name on it. So when you're drinking a 10-year-old whiskey, you're not necessarily drinking only 10-year-old whiskey, but it's a minimum of 10 years old. So I think that pretty much describes for the layman whiskey, the different kinds of whiskey, the grains used. So with the Gaelic word for cheers, slanja, let's have our first wee dram of the day. Nectar of the gods, indeed. So if I can share my screen here, I've got this little presentation. As I mentioned, Tony asked me to talk about whiskey. I thought it's appropriate, as we're celebrating the life of a Celtic saint, to focus on whiskies from two countries in particular, quite famous for their whiskies indeed, Ireland and Scotland. So without saying you have to drink these today, I chose Jameson and Redbreast to represent Ireland in the red corner here, and over to the right, Clenrothes and Ardbeg representing Scotland. You will see from the spelling above here that there is a different spelling. It still means whiskey. The definition is still the same. The ingredients are still the same. I have to confess, being a Scotsman, I believe whiskey was first distilled in Ireland before it was distilled in Scotland, and they decided, or the derivation from the Irish Gaelic into English included the letter E towards the end. The Scots, for whatever reason, decided that they were not going to have the E, and Tony would tell you that the thrifty Scots had to buy that extra vowel and declined. So whiskey is probably, with the E, is probably the most common spelling across the world, certainly in the United States and Ireland and most other countries. Those not using the E, just the KY at the end, are Scotland, Japan, and I believe Canada. Again, it doesn't make any difference. I just hate to see a single malt Scotch whiskey spelled with an E. That's a personal thing. Looking at this map of Ireland showing the distilleries, you can see quite a few. This would be Northern Ireland, part of the United Kingdom. To give it its full title, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And if you were to ask for a whiskey there, you'd probably get a Bushmills. The rest of the island, from the northwest here all the way down here, is simply Ireland. The old name is Eire, E-I-R-E, and it's an independent country. It's part of the European Union and will remain in the European Union after, in my opinion, the ill-fated Brexit. If you're in Southern Ireland in a bar, and there's a few of them, ask for a whiskey, you'd probably get a Jameson's. Scotland's a little bit more complicated. We have over 110, I believe, at the current count, distilleries. So in our wisdom, we've decided we need to break the country into 5 or 6 regions to describe the different whiskies. If we were all together in a live tasting, enjoying the same 5 or 6 drams in a hall, 30 or 40 of us, and doing a Scotch tasting, I'd certainly start with the lowlands here. That area spreads from the border with England all the way up to the River Clyde, Glasgow essentially here on the west coast, over to north of Edinburgh on the River Forth, the Firth of Forth, up into the Kingdom of Fife. Whiskies out of the lowlands tend to be light in nature, very easy drinking, maybe grassy flavours. You pick up the barley from the single malts from that area. And they're sometimes called breakfast whiskies because they're nice and light and go well with cornflakes. The largest geographic region is the Highlands here. The old Caledonian forest covered much of that, and as the trees died and were absorbed into the earth, produced a peatier soil, a richer soil, which of course gets into the grains used in the whiskies. In this region, you'll also find many of the distilleries will finish or age exclusively their whiskies in casks that have been used for sherry, for port, some red wines. So that'll add to the richness of flavour. Speyside, this little blue area here, if my pointer will work, is a special district of itself within the Highlands area. And it's a special region for two distinct reasons. One is that about half the distilleries in all of Scotland, roughly 50, are in this Speyside area. And the River Spey, which is famous for its salmon fishing, and therefore has a lot of pure, clear, fresh, cold water, which is ideal for whiskey production. As I mentioned earlier, grain, water, and yeast are the three ingredients. Moving north to the Orkney Islands off the northeast coast here, currently two distilleries there, Scapa and Highland Park. Over to the Isle of Skye, with Talisker being the only distillery there. The Isle of Mull, with one distillery producing two brands. Jura, with the Jura whisky, and Arran, with two distilleries, only one old enough to sell whisky at the moment, including Robert Burns whisky. Islay here in the light green is again a region within a region on this small island, which you can easily drive in a couple of hours even on one-lane roads. Had 8 distilleries when I visited maybe 6 or 7 years ago, and currently has, I believe, 12 or 13. If you're familiar with the Islay whiskies, you'll know they're famous for the peaty, smoky, seaweed, iodine flavour, particularly from 3 distilleries, all within walking distance on the southeast coast here: Laphroaig, Lagavulin, and Ardbeg. It's actually rumoured that, or said that, these Islay whiskies were imported into the US during Prohibition because they smelled so medicinal that no one believed people would drink them voluntarily, believe it or not. The last region here is Campbelltown, which is a town down in the southwest of this peninsula. And at one time, that area held the most distilleries in Scotland. With the advent of Prohibition and the switch in tastes worldwide from amber liquors to the clearer liquors like gin and vodka, the reduction in whisky production and export from Scotland, over time all of the distilleries in Campbelltown were closed, shuttered, mothballed, demolished. And only in the last 5 or 6 years have 2 or 3 distilleries reopened there, and therefore it can be its own region again. Moving on here, these are just some photographs of distilleries. This one happens to be Bladnoch in the southwest of Scotland. I want you to notice this feature here, the pagoda-style roof. Clenrothes, which I had a wee taste of today, also with the pagoda roof, and that's in Speyside. And another Speyside distillery, the Balvenie, also with the pagoda roof. Despite the fact that you can get some fine whiskies out of Japan there these days, the pagoda roof is very practical. The malting and distillation process produces a lot of heat. The heat will rise, and therefore this pagoda roof provides a very efficient method of of ventilation. The malting floor here, this is a malted barley at Balvenie. Take notice of this high-tech tool here. It's called a broom. Shovels and rakes will also be used, and the grain will be spread over the malting floor. Water will be added. It extracts the enzymes from the grain, and then the germination process will be stopped after maybe 30 to 45 hours, depending on the distillery. And this is then be dried. And the fuel here can be any common fuel. For the peated whiskies, particularly in Islay, and some special releases from Highland and Speyside whiskies, they will use peat. And again, the aroma from the peat will rise, get into the product, and provide that, in some cases, I think, lovely peaty, smoky element to the whiskey. This is where the water and the yeast is added, and this extracts the alcohols, which we're all aiming for, out of the sugars, and produces a product called beer or wort, which is about 6 to 8% alcohol, roughly the same alcohol content as many beers. This is another mash tun, this one metal, at the Balvenie Distillery. The next process is essentially boiling in a kettle, in my simple mind. The kettle in this case being a large, usually a copper still. They'll come in many shapes and sizes, as I'll show you here. Let me skip ahead to this one. This is a very tall still. I've forgotten which distillery it's in. It may be one of the Arran distilleries. And I understand that the taller the still, the more contact the alcohol has with the copper, therefore you'll get a lighter product in the end. I'd like to move back to this slide in that it shows more than one still. So the liquid here will be heated. The alcohol's lighter than air, will rise up this column, come more into contact here, cool, turn back into a liquid, and go into a collecting tank or pipe, move on for the second and or third distillation, and then move on for addition to the cask to be aged. This is done through what's called a spirit safe, and this is the distilled product, which is called new make. And if you can see clearly enough from this slide, it is clear, like a gin or a vodka, again because the colour in the whiskey is picked up from the wood in the aging process in the casks. So the master distiller will watch this process. He'll probably cut off what's called the heads, the first part of the run, and send that back for redistillation. It just, because it's the first part of a particular run, it may contain some elements that he doesn't want in his finished product. The bulk of the run, called the heart, will go down here and be stored for aging. And then as we're getting towards the end or the tails of the run, it'll be diverted again back for redistillation. So 80, 85, 90% of the run will go off for aging. This is just yet another spirit safe at the Balvenie Distillery. The cooperage, some distilleries still have their own cooperage, and most of the oak barrels that are used in, certainly in the Scotch whisky industry, originate in the United States and have been used for bourbon. By US law, a cask can only be used one time in producing bourbon. That was, I understand, at the instigation of the Coopers Union way back maybe 100 years or so ago, to keep them in business. So currently they can only be used once. They're then shipped over to Scotland, Ireland, maybe other countries. And inspected there, maybe recharred to add some smoke and character to the whiskey product, excuse me. And I was very pleased to see here a young cooper, so going through their apprenticeship. And for those of you who are BBC fans and like Doctor Who, in their spare time they produce this little Dalek from Extra Parts. Perhaps the most important phase of the whiskey making process, the aging in wooden casks in Ireland and oak casks in Scotland specifically. And I should have mentioned that if you do like single malts and you like Celtic single malts, Penderyn out of another of the Celtic nations, the 7 Celtic nations from Wales, is well worth trying. So the whiskey will sit here in these casks for a minimum of 3 years, often much longer. They may be aged in a single cask. Sometimes they'll be transferred or finished in sherry, port, other wine casks. It all depends what product the distillery is looking for at this time. This one happens to be at the Balvenie Distillery also in Speyside. The casks, depending on the distillery, will sit in one area for that period of time. They may be moved to a higher shelf where there'll be a little bit more heat, recycled, moved around. And during this time of maturation, the barrels are made of wood and therefore they're porous, so we'll get some alcohol releasing and rising to the heavens, and that's very affectionately known as the angel share. It can be as much as 2 to 3% per annum, which partly explains why 50-year-old whiskies are so expensive. Very little of the product's left. A couple of other slides just to show that I also shared my custom in Ireland. This is the Jameson facility in Dublin, no longer an active distillery, a visitor centre and museum now. And one little hint, if you do go there, enjoy the experience, and if you take the whiskey tour, when they ask for volunteers, be one of the first to raise your hand. At the end of the interesting tour, you'll be sat down at tables, and everyone who hasn't volunteered will be given a wee taste of Jameson's. The volunteers will be given another couple of whiskies, maybe Irish, maybe a Scottish whisky there, and asked to compare them, and needless to say, encouraged to vote for Jameson as your favourite. This is on display, or was on display when I visited. You can see some of these casks are more than 100 years old, and they're displaying some of their fine product here. This is one of the pot stills that I presume was used when this was an active distillery. It's now for display in the forecourt of the visitor centre. Moving down to Cork, this is the Jameson facility where all of their product is currently distilled. Again, they have a display pot still out here in the garden or the yard. And those of you who know me will see that I've maintained the same hairstyle over the years. Let me just stop this sharing for a little bit and get into the tasting process. So this is a Glencairn glass, one of the more popular glasses. This is another type of glass that can be used. Maybe I'll use this one for display purposes. You can see that it's much wider at the base here, tapers and then just flares very slightly at the rim, and the Glencairn cask has maybe a more distinct waist here in the middle and then flares out at the top. So if you go onto YouTube and look up whiskey tasting, most of those will follow something like the following process. First of all, look at the colour. Remember that the whiskey has gained its colour from the time in the casks, so the deeper the colour, either the longer it's been in the cask, or it's been perhaps finished in a cask that previously held sherry, or some combination of those two elements. It is legal in Scotland and I believe Ireland to add a non-flavoured colourant to the whisky, but most of the colour does come from the wooden cask. So have a look at the colour, give it a swirl around. It's been sitting in casks. This is a Clenrothes, so for a minimum of 10 years. So some of the oils tend to bind the alcohols together. Give it a good swirl around. You will see that the elements of the liquid will flow down the glass here. That's called the legs, and it's a reflection of the strength of the whisky. The longer the legs take to run down into the body of the liquid, the higher the ABV. Then the important part of nosing. And the reason that's such an important part of the process is that your tongue can pick up the 5 basic flavours. I've got to look at my cheat sheet here, excuse me. Sweet, sour, bitter, salty, and umami. And these flavour buds are in different parts of your tongue. I'm not going to insult you by poking out my tongue to show you that. So that your tongue picks up 5 flavours. Your nose can literally detect hundreds, if not thousands, of aromas and fragrances. So you'll hear the experts say, oh yes, that smells like Christmas cake, or I can pick out the new mown grass, whatever they detect from it. But it is an important part of the process. And then, finally, a wee taste. Nectar of the gods. So this is a single malt Scotch whisky. What do you add to whisky is a common question. Whisky cocktails are quite popular. Japan is a great lover of whisky cocktails. The Rob Roy has been around forever. I have tried a couple of cocktails and don't think there's anything wrong with them. One was an Ardbeg Bloody Mary, with the smoky Ardbeg offsetting the tomato or tomato juice quite well. Another one I believe is called French Manhattan, and that uses whisky, Chambourg, and bitters. Again, quite pleasant. I wouldn't use a $200 whisky in it, but again, you get out of the cocktail what you put into it, so you try a decent whisky. Now, what to add? For me, if it's a single malt Scotch, water is the only thing. You can do that quite simply with a drinking straw, dip it in a glass of water, finger on the top to create a vacuum, and science in action. Oh, I didn't do that one very well. We get a couple of drops of water. That's not going to be enough to impair the master distiller's intent in bottling this, in this case at 40% alcohol by volume. You're not going to weaken it that much. So repeat the process, give it a good swirl. The water is really going to release the oils and the aromas in the whisky. Give it a good sniff and then a wee taste. Again, letting it flow over your tongue, over these 5 taste buds. So hopefully you may have some questions or some comments, and especially if you did try a wee dram with me today. And again, I'm going to encourage you to drink responsibly, do not drink and drive. If you have any comment on whether you managed to do a taste with and without water, and if you notice the difference. So I'm going to conclude by sharing my screen again here. And Tony did invite me, and I believe scrolling along the bottom of this presentation would be a link to American Friends of Erskine's PayPal account. American Friends of Erskine is a 501c3 here in the United States. It was formed roughly 11 years ago to support Erskine Veterans Hospital in Scotland. Erskine exists because there is no VA system. So for the special care that veterans need and deserve, they rely on volunteer hospitals such as Erskine. They have a number of facilities in Erskine itself, which sits essentially below the Erskine Bridge, which takes you out of Glasgow and into the north of Scotland. They have resident facilities. They are day centres where veterans can come and participate in various activities, from playing pool, sitting up a cup of coffee, woodworking, metalworking, and the like. In the centre of this picture, which was taken at the Erskine Military Ball in Glasgow last year, is the CEO of Erskine, Ian Cumming, MBE, and he leads the staff at the facilities there in caring for the veterans and in raising the necessary funds. I've been proud to be president of American Friends of Erskine, just beginning my second year. I'm here with my wife Jane, and over here is a good friend of mine, past chief of the Caledonian Club, again like myself, and past president of American Friends of Erskine, David Scott, and his wife, also called Jean. So thank you for your attention. I hope you enjoy the rest of your St. Patrick's Day Take 2. And once again, Slanja, enjoy the rest of the entertainment today. Thank you. Water of life.